If your house caught the plague in 1348, the city of Milan did not send doctors. They sent men with bricks and walled your entire family inside to die in the dark. Sick or healthy, it did not matter. You were sealed in. It was a brutal strategy, but it worked. Milan escaped with the lowest death rate in Italy. But sealing doors was not the strangest thing happening inside medieval cities during the Black Death. When the death toll exploded, governments did not just fight the disease, they fought the psychological collapse of the survivors. Officials in other quarantined zones made it a strict crime to ring a church bell or wear mourning clothes. They were trying to censor the sound of mass death so the public would not lose their minds. The real story of a quarantined city is not just about the victims. It is about the mechanical reality of keeping society running when the world is ending. And we have the original civic records and modern bone digs to prove it. From the logistical nightmare of burying thousands in perfectly engineered trenches to the exact moment when the human instinct to protect your own children just vanished. When the outbreak first reached places like Pistoia in May of 1348, the city council did not just tell people to pray. They tried to legislate human behavior. They realized that panic destroys a city infrastructure much faster than bacteria. So they made public grief illegal. The original civic ordinances are ruthlessly specific. If someone in your house died, you were strictly forbidden from ringing the church bells. You could not gather a crowd for a funeral. Only immediate family could carry the body. The magistrates even banned citizens from buying or wearing new black mourning clothes. The government was trying to censor the sensory experience of mass death. They knew if the bells rang for every victim, they would never stop. The constant noise and the sight of streets flooded with black garments caused healthy citizens to lose their minds. If the bakers, the guards, and the merchants fled in terror, the city would starve before the disease even finished its work. We usually picture the Middle Ages as an era of pure religious superstition, people whipping themselves and waiting for the apocalypse. But these documents show a cold, calculated bureaucracy desperately trying to project order. But you can only hide the dead for so long. By midsummer, the laws of Pistoia and similar laws across Europe completely collapsed. The death toll in major cities skyrocketed. In places like London, it went from a few dozen a week to over 200 bodies a day. The small local parish graveyards filled up instantly. The traditional system of a wooden coffin, a priest, and an individual plot shattered. City authorities now faced a massive mechanical problem. They had thousands of rapidly decomposing bodies in the summer heat, and absolutely nowhere to put them. You cannot just throw them in the river without poisoning the survivors' water. To stop the city from choking on its own dead, they had to engineer a new system of mass disposal, and they had to build it overnight. In London, the solution was a massive emergency burial ground called East Smithfield. For decades, historians assumed medieval mass graves were just chaotic pits dug in pure panic. But modern bioarchaeology destroyed that myth. When researchers excavated the East Smithfield site, they did not find a jumbled pile of bones. They found a terrifyingly perfect grid. The diggers arranged the bodies in precise trenches, laid out neatly from west to east. They stacked the victims exactly 5 deep, like tightly packed cargo. And they used a brilliant, desperate piece of engineering to make it work. Charcoal. Workers packed thick layers of charcoal between the corpses. The magistrates knew charcoal acts as an industrial sponge. They had to absorb the massive volume of biological fluid that leaks out when thousands of humans decompose simultaneously. If those fluids seeped into the water table, the survivors would drink the infection. It was an attempt to fight panic with geometry. The authorities believed that if the graves remained orderly, the minds of the citizens might remain orderly too. But the math turned against them. The charcoal trenches worked when the death rate was 50 a day. But as the sick were packed tighter together in the slums, the infection route shifted. The bacteria did not mutate, but the transmission did. It was not just bubonic anymore, spread by the bite of infected fleas. It became pneumonic. Victims started coughing up blood, transmitting the pathogen directly through the air, human to human. The death rate exploded. Soon, the grave diggers themselves started collapsing inside the trenches they were digging. This is the tipping point, where a logistical crisis becomes a total psychological collapse. When the physical space for the dead runs out, the social contract shatters. You see this exact shift in the historical records of Siena, Italy. A local tax collector named Agnolo di Tura kept a daily chronicle of the disaster. He watched the organized burial system fail. He watched the streets fill up with bodies because there was no one left to carry them, and no charcoal left to pack them. Agnolo wrote that the city fell so silent you could hear dogs tearing at the shallow graves. And then, he recorded the ultimate breaking point of his own life. Agnolo di Tura had to dig a trench and bury his own 5 children with his bare hands. Once the infrastructure broke, the people realized the government could not save them. Priests stopped visiting the sick. Doctors refused to enter the houses. The citizens were entirely on their own. So they made a dark choice. They locked their doors, hoarded their food, and abandoned the outside world. But the bacteria was already inside, and what happened behind those locked doors reveals the darkest reality of the Black Death. The plague destroyed something older than the city itself, the biological drive to protect your own blood. When the symptoms appeared, the dark, agonizing lumps in the groin or armpit, the panic overrode human evolution. Agnolo di Tura wrote that the terror was so absolute that fathers refused to approach their infected sons. Mothers slid bowls of water across the floor and backed away from their dying children. The home, which was supposed to be the ultimate sanctuary, became a solitary confinement cell. People suffocated alone in their bedrooms, and neighbors only realized they were dead when the smell finally breached the walls. Then, the trajectory of the disease abruptly shifted. By late 1349, the death toll collapsed. The air cleared. The surviving half of the population finally unbolted their doors and stepped outside. If you look at this through a modern lens, you would expect these people to be completely broken. You would expect a continent-wide depression. Instead, the exact opposite happened. The Florentine chronicler Matteo Villani, writing just after the outbreak, documented a massive, chaotic wave of hedonism. The survivors looked around and realized they were standing in a world of empty houses, abandoned estates, and unclaimed wealth. Because the labor force was wiped out, the wages for the poorest workers instantly tripled. Peasants who had spent their entire lives tied to the dirt were suddenly wearing the silk clothes of dead merchants and drinking imported wine in the taverns. The immediate reaction to surviving the apocalypse was not quiet grief. It was reckless existence. Villani recorded that people spent their sudden fortunes aggressively through massive banquets and rushed into hasty marriages with complete strangers. They had looked over the absolute edge of human extinction, and they realized that delaying gratification was a joke. Tomorrow was not guaranteed, so they consumed everything today. The strict medieval rules of social class had snapped in half. But as the survivors celebrated in the streets, they did not realize they were leaving something permanent behind in those trenches. The rulers of Milan tried to stop the end of the world with bricks. The engineers in London genuinely believed they could contain the horror by stacking bodies in perfectly aligned charcoal-packed trenches. But the original 1348 records prove that a city is not made of infrastructure. It is a fragile psychological agreement. When the mortality rate crossed a mathematical threshold, that agreement simply evaporated. The state failed to censor the reality of mass death. The logistics of the grave collapsed under airborne transmission. And the deepest biological instinct we possess, a parent's drive to protect a child, shattered completely behind locked doors in Siena. The ultimate legacy of the medieval quarantine is not just the mechanics of the horror. It is the bizarre, explosive resilience of the people who walked out of those houses when the dying finally stopped. They did not quietly rebuild the old world. They broke the feudal wage system, drank the wine of the dead elites, and chose a reckless, vibrant life over mourning. Think back to that house in Milan. Imagine sitting inside, listening to city officials seal your front door shut. The state locked you in the dark because they believed survival required sacrificing human empathy. But the survivors of the Black Death proved that even after witnessing the total failure of society, our default setting is not despair. It is an aggressive, unapologetic drive to keep existing. If the invisible rules keeping your city running dissolve tomorrow, what is the first thing you would abandon to survive? If you enjoyed this story, subscribe. There are plenty more where this came from. See you in the next one.